Yes, Mr. Edwards.
My Lords, this is an appeal against the order of Mr. Justice Meade revoking 3 patents of my client's Optis following trial C of these proceedings, and it's brought with the permission of my Lord Justice Arnold. As your Lordships would have seen, the only issue for the judge at trial was whether the patents were valid, and he found them invalid for lack of inventive step over another item of prior art called Ericsson. He rejected all the other invalidity attacks, and Apple doesn't seek to revive any of those attacks. So the only issue for your Lordships on this appeal is whether the judge was right to find the patents invalid in light of Ericsson. Now, as the judge did, your Lordships can decide this case on the basis of 2 exemplary claims, namely claims 1 and 4 of the 953 patent, and they're representative of what we called at trial the unspecified claims and the specified claims, respectively. So, like the judge, I'm going to refer to the 953 patent as the patent. So, the patent relates to LTE, which, as you know, is the 4th generation or 4G mobile telecom system developed by 3GPP. And the particular bit of the standard we're looking at was developed by the RAN 1 working group. So, the skilled person, for the purposes of our case, is a RAN 1 worker. That's paragraph 39 of the judgment. Now, the patent solved a problem that was facing RAN 1 in 2008, and we'll obviously need to look at this, but in brief, the problem was how to allocate different search spaces to mobiles in respect of a downlink control channel called PDCCH. And the Ericsson prior art document represented where RAN 1 had got to in solving that problem by the priority date, and it contained what RAN 1 thought was a solution. It didn't work. There's no dispute that, in fact, contrary to what was thought at the time of the document, the Ericsson solution doesn't work. And there's no dispute either about the fact that of the very many alternative solutions that were put forward in response to Ericsson after the priority date, the one that was selected for incorporation into LTE was the one put forward by LGE. And as you'd expect, LGE obtained patents for their solution, and those patents are now owned by my clients, and they're the patents subject to this appeal. So it's also not disputed that LGE's solution is now used by every 4G phone in the world up to 1,000 times per second, as we'll see. So I'm going to address your Lordships on 5 topics. First, the standard of review on an appeal like this, and obviously I don't need to say very much about that because it's very familiar to your Lordships. Second, the relevant technical background, and under this heading I'll explain the problem facing RAN 1 and where RAN 1 had got to as reflected in the Ericsson document. Third, I'll explain the solution of the patent. Fourth, I'll identify the steps which the judge said would be obvious steps to take from the Ericsson prior art to the solution of the patent. And I make no apology for stressing the word steps, plural. This was not a case where it was said that the invention involved one simple and obvious modification to the prior art. It was a case where it was said that a number of steps from the prior art would eventually lead to the invention. And then fifth, I'll identify the errors of the judge in finding that those steps were obvious. So, first topic, standard of review, which obviously depends on the nature of the appeal. And we don't shrink from acknowledging that in the main, this appeal is a challenge to an evaluative decision, with all that that brings with it. However, some of our grounds turn on or involve construction of a document, namely NRC 3, and I'll identify those aspects when I get to them. The appeal does not involve any challenge to findings of primary fact. So, insofar as this appeal is an appeal against an evaluative decision, we suggest that the correct approach is summarised in the judgment of this court in Prescott and Potter-Mayanos. Can I just briefly show your Lordships that? It's in the Authorities Bundle, tab 2.
Spread room.
Sorry?
Spread room.
Sprint room.
Sprint room.
Yeah.
Your Lordship has the advantage. Sprint, you're right, yes, I understand.
The point is that it's better known under that name.
That's
I think my lord, like I, was a bit mystified when we saw the reference to the skeleton to Prescott was Almianos, but once we understood it was Sprint Room, then we realised what you were talking about.
Right, well, there we are. I've revealed my ignorance, and I won't make that mistake the next time. Sprint room, the relevant passage is in page 76 of the bundle. And we've marked the relevant passage. The point being made here as this is that in a case like this, involving an evaluative decision, the court asks simply whether the judge was wrong rather than whether he was plainly wrong. And you see that on page 77 of the bundle in paragraph 419. That's paragraph 419 of the judgment of the Court of Appeal in IBM and Dalgleish. So, your Lordship sees the conclusion in 419. And then similar things were said by the Supreme Court in AR and Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police. That's quoted on page 78 in paragraphs, so you've got paragraphs 64 and 65 of the AR case in the Supreme Court. And then the conclusion that was drawn, that the court in the Sprint Room case drew from that, is in paragraph 76, conclusional summary. And we say, so that talks about flaws in the judge's treatment of the question, such as a gap of logic, etc., lack of consistency, and so on. And we, of course, say we can identify several such flaws in the judge's treatment of the question of obviousness. Now, my learned friend submits that the question for your lordships is whether the judge made a decision that no reasonable judge could have reached, or that was rationally insupportable. And we say that's the standard for challenging a finding of fact, and it's not applicable here, as this case shows. But just to make absolutely clear, we do submit that the judge's decision on obviousness was not rationally supportable in that sense, and that I do make that submission in respect of each of the errors I identify, even though we say it's not necessary to go that far. I also, that's what I want to show you in the authorities bundle. It's also convenient for me to here acknowledge that my learned friend will be able to say at very many points that the judge had evidence to support his decision in the form of Professor Lozano, the expert she called at trial. Of course, the fact that Professor Lozano supported Apple's case doesn't make the judgment immune from your lordship's scrutiny. The judge's task was to assess Professor Lozano's evidence critically, and he had to consider whether Professor Lozano's claims about what the skilled person would have done with Ericsson really did represent obvious things to do without knowledge of the invention, or whether Professor Lozano was merely reciting a chain of steps towards a known goal. Our submission, as I've said, is the only rational conclusion was that it was the latter, and that the judge's acceptance of Professor Lozano's evidence was flawed in the relevant sense.
Yes, can I just ask a question like that? You've emphasised twice already, and I know there's going to be many more times when you emphasise this, and I understand why. The fact that this is a case involving step-by-step analysis. And one can see from the judgment there was no dispute between the parties before the judge as to the basic principles so far as that's concerned. And I take it that there's no dispute so far as this court is concerned. Technograph is a very familiar authority. However, I do wonder if, even though it's not in dispute and familiar, it may be worth actually looking at some point over the course of this appeal, because it is rather central to your case on this appeal. And therefore, it may be that there's no harm in us all reminding ourselves of what it actually says.
Well, my lord, with respect, may I embrace what your lordship has said? I was going to make some submissions on Technograph, perhaps.
But it's not in the bundle.
No, indeed, and it will be by this afternoon. I was going to make some submissions sort of on the basis that everybody knows what it says, but your lordship makes a very good point, and I embrace it. And I will, as I say, I was going to make some points on Technograph, and I will make them by reference to the actual. Well, I'll get to them this morning, in fact, but we will we'll make sure we've got copies and we'll look at them. I won't anticipate now what I'm going to say. What I was going to say about that. I was going to move on to the second topic, which
Yes.
is well, actually, my lord, since you raised it, may I just give you a one line? The warning that Lord Diplock made was particularly that the steps that are constructed in a case such as this, they don't reflect the actual steps that the inventors took. So in this case, necessarily, and we know in this case they don't reflect the steps the inventors took. So in this case, I will be able to submit, well, this step is that's a stupid thing to do. I mean, I paraphrase. That's an irrational thing to do. And of course, your lordships might think, well, hang on a second, but the inventors did that. And the answer, of course, is no, they didn't. They got to the invention by a completely different route. So it's very important when one analyses the steps that one doesn't fall into the trap of thinking, well, they must be rational to the extent that LGE did them, because they didn't do those steps. That's to anticipate where I'm coming to. I was going to move on to the second topic, which is the technical background problem and culminating in the prior art. So the common general knowledge and technical background is set out in the judgment at 47 to 104, and we don't dispute any of that, but I'll summarise the key points that your lordships need to know for this appeal. And everything I say under this heading would have been known to a skilled person working on the prior art. And when I describe what was envisaged for the LTE system, I'll use the present tense, although of course no LTE systems have been built by that date.
What was the priority date?
It was February 2008. The exact date was 19th of February 2008. So this case concerns the PDCCH. That's a downlink control channel, so a channel transmitted by the base station containing control messages for mobile devices. Mobiles are called UEs in LTE parlance. And the messages which the base station sends on the PDCCH are called downlink control information, or DCI. And the base station in LTE is called the E-node B, but I'm going to call it the base station. And so the base station is constantly sending DCI messages for different UEs on the PDCCH. Just a point of terminology, the term PDCCH can be used to describe both the overall shared channel containing DCI messages for all the UEs in the cell, and you can also use PDCCH to describe the individual control channel between the base station and a single UE. In fact, it's always clear from context what one's talking about. So now the problem arises, how does the UE find the messages that are for it on the overall PDCCH? One possibility would be for the UE to be told exactly where on the PDCCH to find its messages, but that would be a very inefficient way of sharing the PDCCH. It also require a lot of additional messages, and then you get into a bootstraps problem. Another possibility would be for the UE to search the entire PDCCH for its own messages, but that would be too burdensome, because as we'll see, the UE has to find its DCI messages in 1 millisecond. Okay, so that's the issue. Before getting to the solution, I need to explain the structure of the PDCCH in a bit more detail. And that's addressed by the judge at paragraph 63 onwards. So the PDCCH is part of the downlink, which is transmitted using OFDMA, orthogonal frequency divisional multiple access. Happily, we don't need to get into what OFDMA is, other than to know it just means the channel is divided up by both time and frequency. So the downlink in LTE is organised into frames of 10 milliseconds long. Each frame is divided into 10 subframes. Each subframe is divided into 2 slots, but you can ignore the slots. You need to think of the 10 millisecond frames and the 1 millisecond subframes. And that's because the DCI messages are sent each subframe, so the task has to be carried out each subframe every 1 millisecond. The smallest unit of resource on the downlink is a resource element, RE. And I'm just telling you that because you'll see RE in the judgment. But you don't need to worry about what REs are, because they're grouped together into things called control channel elements, CCE. And for our purposes, it's the CCEs that are the building blocks of the PDCCH. So CCE is a bit of the PDCCH. That's all one really needs to know, but the judge gives the full detail. Each DCI message is transmitted using a number of CCEs, and that number of CCEs depends on both the information content of the particular message and the coding scheme. And so as a result, a DCI message may be sent using 1, 2, 4, or 8 CCEs. And these are the CCE aggregations that your lordships will have seen in the judgment. So a CCE aggregation means an aggregation of 1, 2, 4, or 8 CCEs on which a single DCI message may be transmitted to a single UE. Now this makes life more complicated because the UE, they don't know whether they're being sent a DCI message, and they don't know what size of CCE aggregation will be used to send the message if they are, and they don't know which aggregation of CCEs actually contains its DCI message. Now, the way that the UE looks for its DCI messages is called blind decoding, and I know that some of your lordships know about blind decoding from the previous case. Blind decoding was described by the judge at paragraphs 83 to 87. And again, he goes into the technical details. But essentially what the UE does is it takes a bit of the PDCCH, it takes a CCE aggregation, and it just attempts to decode it. So it might take a 2 CCE aggregation and attempt to decode it. And in this example, that 2 CCE aggregation is called a control channel candidate, because the UE doesn't know where its own personal PDCCH is, but that 2 CCE aggregation in this example is a candidate. And if the control channel candidate is successfully decoded, then the UE knows it's found a DCI message intended for it, and if not, not. That's essentially the process. And so we can now restate the problem as how to determine which parts of the PDCCH each UE should be blind decoding. And both the base station and the UE need to know this. Base station needs to know where each UE is looking so that it knows, so that it can place the DCI message somewhere where that UE will be looking. And the UE needs to know where to look to find the messages placed by the base station. So this problem was discussed at several meetings of RAN 1 in 2007 and 2008. And it was at the RAN 1 meeting in February 2008, the 11th to 15th of February 2008, that a PowerPoint presentation was produced summarising where RAN 1 had got to. And that is the Ericsson document. And please can we look at that? It's in the supplemental bundle, tab 3. Now we call the document Ericsson Trial because it was a presentation on Ericsson branded slides, but this wasn't an Ericsson proposal. As you can see, this is the outcome of offline discussions amongst those people at RAN 1 generally from different companies who are working on this problem. So that's what you see from the title slide, PDCCH blind decoding, outcome of offline discussions. And then slide 2 on page 82 of the bundle summarises the agreement so far. And the first bullet says tree-based aggregation. And now, tree-based aggregation refers to a particular way of organising the PDCCH. And to explain what that means, can we please look at a diagram which the judge reproduced in the judgment? And for this purpose, if it's possible for your lordships to have this diagram open and Ericsson open at the same time, that would be extremely helpful. So the diagram is in the core bundle, tab 6, page 87. So if you've got that diagram on page 87, I'd like your lordships to start with just to look at the top part of this diagram. So those first 4 rows of rectangles, and ignore the colouring for now. And what those 4 rows represent is the same PDCCH, but just represented in 4 different ways. So in the very first row, you see 32 rectangles. And those 32 rectangles are 32 CCEs, or you could call them 1 CCE aggregations, because a 1 CCE aggregation is just a single CCE. So each of those 32 blocks could contain a DCI message. In the next row, it's the same PDCCH, but this time it's organised into 2 CCE aggregations. So there are only 16 2 CCE aggregations, or 16 control candidates. But note that they've not used all possibilities, all combinations in the second row. First of all the aggregations are consecutive, so there are no aggregations made up of non-consecutive CCEs. Second, the aggregations start at positions 0, 2, 4, 6, and so on. In computer, as you know, in computer science, and in this case, we always count from 0, not from 1. So there's a 2 CCE aggregation consisting of the CCEs at positions 0 and 1, but there is no aggregation consisting of the CCE at position 1 and the CCE at position 2. And that's what Ericsson means. If you go back to Ericsson and you see it says 2 CCE every second location. And they start at 0, 2, 4, 6, and so on. And then you see the same thing in the third row. Again, the same PDCCH, same 32 CCEs, but this time collected into 4 CCE aggregations. And there are only 8 4 CCE aggregations, 8 control channel candidates. And again, they're all consecutive. And this time they start at positions 0, 4, 8, and so on, which is stated in the Ericsson slide, and the same for the 8 CCE aggregations. So each of these rows of this is one PDCCH represented 4 different ways. Each of these rows is called an aggregation level. So we can say about this PDCCH, there are 16 control channel candidates at aggregation level 2 and 4 candidates at aggregation level 8. For example. And that's how we use the expression aggregation level. And this is the tree-based structure referred to in slide 2 of Ericsson. It means conceptualizing the PDCCH as 4 aggregation levels and organizing those 4 levels like this. And the purpose is to drastically reduce the number of possible control channel candidates. So at aggregation level 2, in this PDCCH, you could in theory have up to 992 2 CCE aggregations, but doing it this way reduces that number to 16. So if we could go back to slide 2 of Ericsson, the second bullet says that the number of CCEs available in a cell can vary. Excuse me, let me start again. The number of available CCEs in a cell depends on various things, and so it can vary. And in fact, the number of CCEs can vary subframe to subframe. It can be more or less than the 32. And the UEs will know the number of CCEs in a subframe from other signaling in the base station. So everybody knows how many CCEs there are. They can vary. Then if we go to the third slide of Ericsson, this is about search space, and the first bullet point says search space. And what this means is that the UE will not do blind decoding of the whole PDCCH at every aggregation level. Instead, it will have part of the PDCCH which it must search each subframe, and that's its search space. And then the first sub-bullet is set of aggregated CCEs with a certain aggregation level. And this is saying that there will be a search space comprising a set of CCE aggregations at each aggregation level. So if we look at the diagram again, just focusing on the first 4 rows, which you see are labelled user number 1. I hope you can see that in your one that's very small, I'm afraid. The green colouring shows the search spaces for a single UE, and you can see it has a different search space at each aggregation level. So the green coloured are the CCEs that it will be searching, its search space. Then the next bullet in Ericsson says that the UE performs blind decoding of all PDCCH payloads possible for the given aggregation level and search space. So within the allocated search space, at a given aggregation level, the UE will perform blind decoding of all possible PDCCH payloads. And the reference to all possible payloads, that's a reference to the fact that a particular CCE aggregation may contain a DCI message of a different length at a higher level, different length. Obviously, at the physical layer, it will be that particular length. And they're called different payloads. And this was explained by the judge at paragraph 81. But the upshot is that when blind decoding a particular control channel candidate, the UE actually has to have more than one go at decoding that candidate. And in fact, we'll see it in a minute. It has to have 2 attempts at each candidate. So back to Ericsson, the next bullet says some payloads may be possible depending on the configuration, that's all important. Then it says, then you've got a bullet CCEs in a search space. Firstly, all CCEs are contiguous, and we've seen that already in the diagram, that all the CCEs in an aggregation are contiguous. And then it says CCEs in a set are contiguous. Sets are spaced with a fixed number of CCEs apart. So again, if you go back to the diagram, still looking at user number 1, you see that each of its 4 search spaces is contiguous, i.e. at each aggregation level, the candidates it blind decodes are all next to each other. And this is quite important because if the search space is always contiguous, it means you can define a search space at a given aggregation level simply by defining its start point and its size. Just for information, the search spaces can wrap around, but that's not a complexity your lordships need to worry about. So I'm back on the slide on page 83 of Ericsson. The second big bullet says search spaces defined per aggregation level. And again, you can see that on the diagram. Again, just looking at user number 1, at each aggregation level, its search space starts at a different place. So the search space is defined as a different starting place for each aggregation level. And then the final bullet on slide 3, page 83, is common and UE-specific search spaces defined. Now, we're only interested in the UE-specific search space. Your lordships can ignore the common search space. So then over the page, slide 4 of Ericsson is about the common search space, so we can move past that. Slide 5 on page 85 is about the UE-specific search space. That's what we're interested in. So the first point made about that is approximately 30 blind decoding attempts. So that's the number of blind decoding attempts the working group has decided is feasible in a 1 millisecond subframe. Aggregation levels 1, 2, 4, and 8. Your lordships know what that means by now. Then it's got a list headed decoding attempts per payload size, assuming 2 payload sizes per aggregation level. So that means we're assuming that at each aggregation level, there are 2 possible payload sizes, so you'll have to do 2 blind decoding attempts for every CCE aggregation. And then it's got a list, 6 decoding attempts of 1 CCE aggregation, 6 of 2, 2 of 4, and 2 of 8. And again, this is reflected in our diagram in the judgment on page 87. So again, focusing on user number 1, you can see that at aggregation level 1, it has 6 aggregations to decode. And aggregation level 2, it's got 6 candidates, and 4 at aggregation level, 2 at aggregation level 4 and 2 at aggregation level 8. We've been told that the UE has to do 2 attempts for each candidate, so that makes a total of 32 blind decoding attempts, which is consistent with the approximately 30 at the beginning of that slide. And the rest of this slide is not material. So the diagram, sorry, I said a moment ago that having the search spaces contiguous means you can define a search space by reference to its starting point and its size. If you're going to have fixed size search spaces, as they are, at each aggregation level, that means to define the search space, you only need to define the starting point. So what we've been building up to is, if we lay down these rules, the only thing that we need to define is the starting point of the search space. Just to finish off with the diagram on page 87, hopefully now it makes more sense. What we can see here illustrated is a single subframe of a PDCH comprising 32 CCEs and 6 UEs. And you can see for each user where its search space is each aggregation level. And they've all got different search spaces at different aggregation levels. And this spreading out of search spaces is done to give the base station the best chance of being able to send whatever messages it wants to all the UEs. The bottom row shows what the base station actually transmits on the PDCCH in this subframe. So it's entitled E node B allocation. This is how the E node B, the base station, actually allocates the PDCCH. So in this example, the first 7 CCEs aren't used. Then user number 4, which is light orange, is sent a message on a 1 CCE aggregation. Then the next 8 CCEs are used to send a message to user number 1. Then the next 4 are used to send a message to number 3, and so on. And in this example, each UE will find its message because the base station has sent the message within the search space for that UE at that aggregation level. And you can see that by just following up the bottom row and looking up to the relevant UE, and you will see that they will indeed find their message as one of their 32 blind decoding attempts. Now, it won't always be the case that the base station is able to send a message to every UE in a subframe. And the judge gives an example at paragraph 99 of the judgment, which is on the next page of the judgment. So, if your lordships could read paragraph 99. And the judge gives another example in paragraph 101, which is also worth reading. Now, neither of these examples are disastrous. All that's likely to happen in this scenario is that 1 or 2 UEs will have to wait until the next subframe, 1 millisecond later, to get their message. But the examples do show that the better you can spread out the search spaces, the more easily and the more quickly the base station will be able to send messages to the UEs. The other thing that these 2 examples bring home is that it matters what happens in the next subframe. I said it's not disastrous if a UE is blocked in one subframe because they can get their message in the next subframe, but that assumes that they're not blocked in the next subframe too. And with that consideration in mind, it was recognised by round 1 that not only do you want to spread out the search spaces amongst UEs in a subframe, but you also want to have a different allocation of search spaces in the next subframe, and the next, and the next. And we're going to see that on the next slide of Ericsson. So I'm now back in the Ericsson slides, page 86 of the supplemental bundle. And it says that the starting point of the UE-specific search space to monitor is given by a hashing function. And I've already explained that because the CC aggregations are contiguous and they have a fixed space, the only thing you need to define is the starting point at each aggregation level. And this is saying that the starting point will be given by a hashing function. And the judge explained what a hashing function is briefly at paragraph 88 of the judgment. A hashing function is any function that can be used to map data of potentially arbitrary size to fixed size values. In other words, it is a function that allocates a large number of inputs to a small number of outputs. And obviously that's suitable in this case. If you've got, well, let's take our particular example. You've got in the particular example on page 87 at aggregation level 8, you've got 6 UEs but only 4 potential search spaces. So the hashing function allocates those 4 spaces amongst the 6 UEs. And of course you can have a lot more than 6 UEs in a cell. So Ericsson is recording that round 1 has decided that both the base station and the UE will use a hashing function to determine the starting point of the UE search space at each aggregation level. And the second bullet on slide 6 gives the inputs to the hashing function. And a key thing is that these are all matters known to both the base station and the UE. So both sides can do the hashing function and find the start of the search space for that UE at that aggregation level. And because the hashing function is based on things they both know, there doesn't have to be any communication between them as to where the search space will be. They both just know. So if I can just explain what the inputs are. UEID, that's a temporary identification number for the UE, which the base station allocates to the UE when the UE comes into that base station cell. Aggregation level, you know, that's just a number, 1, 2, 4 or 8. Number of CCEs in this subframe, as I said, the UE knows this from other signals sent by the base station. And the subframe number, that's just a number from 0 to 9. There are 10 subframes in a frame, so that's a number from 0 to 9. And the idea of making that an input into the hashing function is that it means that the output for each UE should be different in each subframe. So I referred earlier to the desirability of that feature, that in each subframe the UE has a different search space from the previous subframe. And the idea of making the subframe number an input into the hashing function means you'll get a different output each subframe. And then the third bullet point on slide 6 is the actual hashing function. And the way this works is as follows. First, you calculate x by multiplying the UEID by 16 and then adding the subframe number. Now, your lordships will probably know this. In binary terms, if you multiply by 16, that has the effect of shifting the bits to the left and adding 4 zeros at the end. So, in fact, x will consist of 20 binary bits. The first 16 bits will be the UEID, and then the last 4 bits will be the subframe number 0 to 9 in binary. And this is important because it means that every value of x is unique amongst all UEs and all subframes. The next bullet has an equation beginning start. And so start as in start of the search space. So to calculate the start position of the search space, first you do kx plus l. So you multiply x by k and then add l. And you can see from the next bullet that k and l are, quote, big enough numbers, unquote, and they're different for each aggregation level. And at this stage, they hadn't worked out what k and l would be. They're just going to be big numbers. So anyway, you do k times x plus l, and then you do the mathematical operation, which is called mod floor, open brackets, number of CCEs, divided by aggregation level, close brackets. So floor, open brackets, number of CCEs divided by aggregation level, close brackets. That's the number of CCEs divided by the aggregation level, rounded down to the nearest whole number. So floor in this context means round down to the nearest whole number. And this expression has been referred to in this case as C, capital C. And C is essentially the number of possible CCE aggregations at a particular aggregation level, given the tree structure. So in our example diagram, there were 32 CCEs. So let's say aggregation level 2. There are 32 divided by 2 equals 16 CCE aggregations. So C, in that case, will be 16. And since each of these CCE aggregations can be the starting point of a search space, C is also the number of possible search space starting points for a given aggregation level. So what this slide is saying is that the start of the search space is obtained by calculating k times x plus l and then doing mod c on that number. And mod c, of course, is a mathematical operation that gives you the remainder when dividing by c. So doing mod c on any number will give you a number between 0 and c minus 1 inclusive. So in our example, using aggregation level 2, the UE and the base station would do mod c on kx plus l, and that would give them a number from 0 to 15, and that would tell them which of the 16 CCE aggregations is the start of the search space for that UE at aggregation level 2. So that's the output of the hashing function, a number between 0 and c minus 1, representing one of the possible starting points. And the final bullet on this slide is a call to verify that we get the desired properties by the above function. It's the last bullet on slide 6.
If I understood it correctly, for each subframe, the only variable between different UEs is the UE ID.
As between, for one UE, as between subframes.
No, for one subframe, as between UEs.
The only variable will be UE IDs at each aggregation, for one subframe at one aggregation level.
Yes.
The only variable will be the UE ID.
Yes.
Yes? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Slide 7 it concerns small number of CCEs, and you don't need to worry about slide 7 of Ericsson. So that was where RAN 1 had got to on this problem by the priority date. And it was subsequently discovered that the Ericsson function didn't work remotely satisfactorily. It didn't spread the search spaces out in a useful way. In some cases, every UE would be given the same search space. I'm going to come back to this in more detail and explain why. But the key point is that it didn't work well enough, and there remained a need for a function that was fit for purpose. So that's the technical background, my second point, and we've reached the priority date. So I now move on to my third topic, which is the solution of the patent. And what the patent does is to take a different approach to allocating search spaces to UEs in a subframe and across the 10 subframes in a frame. And what it does is it uses a random number generator, or RNG, to generate a series of random numbers for each UE. And then it uses those random numbers in an equation to determine the search space starting point for each aggregation level. So in this context, a random number generator, or as I'm going to say from now on, RNG, is a mathematical function that generates a series of random numbers. And I underline series. RNGs work in the following way. You start with a number, usually an arbitrary number called a seed. You then input that number into the mathematical function, and the output is a number. And that output is your first random number. You then put that number back into the function as the input, and the function outputs another number, and that's your second random number, and so on for as long as you want to generate random numbers. And in that way, you get a sequence of random numbers, each uncorrelated to the last. You can then use those numbers to, say, simulate a roulette wheel or a random pattern of electrons or whatever you want to use the random numbers for. So
they're not actually random. They're determined.
They are pseudo-random because they're deterministic. But in this context, it's convenient just to call them random. But your lordship is right. The correct technical term is pseudo-random because they look random, and if you've got a good random number generator, they are indistinguishable from random numbers. But they're deterministic because they're determined by the mathematical function or seed.
And also, you can't go directly and say, I want the fifth number to what the answer is. You have to go through the first four numbers.
You do, unless you're you can do. There are fancy mathematical tricks, but you're essentially correct. We had a discussion about how you could try and directly get the fifth one, and if you've got an enormous computer, you might be able to do something. But so I don't want to say give an unqualified yes, but the answer is, so far as matters, your lordship is right. You have to go through 1, 2, 3, 4 to get number 5. Absolutely.
And is it right? This I hadn't actually. Penny hadn't got before, but the deterministic aspect is important because both the UE and the base station are going to generate these numbers themselves.
Correct.
So it does matter. They're not random as between the UE and the base station, or the whole thing would break down.
Correct. Provided they're using the same seed.
Yes, exactly.
And the same function. Yeah. Yes. So 3 things I want to emphasise about random number generators. First, as I've already said, they're designed to produce a series of random numbers. Second, they're recursive, since the output is fed back in as the input of the next iteration. So I said 3, I meant 2 things I want to emphasise. Now, the invention uses a particular RNG. There are lots of RNGs, and we're going to see different sorts of RNGs mentioned in the papers. The one that the patent uses is called a linear congruential generator, or LCG. And LCGs were described by the judge at paragraphs 106 to 111. And your lordships need to know how an LCG works. So if your lordships could remind yourselves what the judge says at 106 to 111. All of these are important points. So, two points that I'd ask your lordship to underline notionally or literally. Firstly, at 106, the judge records that LCGs were not part of the common general knowledge. He found that there was something that the skilled person would come across when doing a literature search, starting from Ericsson. Second, paragraph 111 is important. An LCG, indeed any RNG, has a period. And in the case of an LCG, the period will never be more than the modulus. Now, the way that the...
Can I ask you a question of terminology?
Yes.
Modular arithmetic is a way of working with remainders.
Yes.
The thing you divide by is called the modulus, the D in this formulation.
Correct.
What do you call the remainder?
The answer, the result, the output.
The output.
Or the mod D.
Mod D.
Mod D is, if mod D is 15, you just say mod D is 15.
Right, thank you.
Now, so we've seen.
Mr. Holmes, can I just make sure I've understood something as well?
Yes.
With this period thing, when this recursive function gets an answer 34, it will, and then the next one after that is 75. It will always be 75 after 34.
Exactly. So the moment you hit 34 again, you'll then be back to 75 and so on. So that means that the period can never be longer than the modulus, because the output has to be one of those numbers. The period can be less than the modulus. I mean, you could divide one you could devise an LCG that went 35, 34, 75, 34, 75.
And the reason why it's bound to recur, the judge says for obvious reasons the period cannot exceed the modulus, is because of what you referred to earlier. Every time you put the same seed number in, you get the same output.
Exactly.
So every time you put 34 in, you're going to get 75 out.
Indeed. And the seed, you've used the word seed incorrectly, my lord.
I'm sorry. Every time you use 34 as an input, you get 75 as an output.
Indeed. And you will only get a maximum of D different possible inputs. So if your modulus is 10, let's say your modulus is 10, there are only 10 possible outputs, 0 to 9. So at best,
once you've used them all up, you're bound to use one you've used
the
before.
very best you can get is all 9, all 10 in some order, and then they have to repeat.
And that's different from rolling a dice, because if you roll a 6, that tells you nothing about what will happen when you roll it again.
Correct.
Does this mean you can't actually tell a computer to roll a dice?
That's a fascinating discussion, my lord. You have to do. The answer is correct. What you can do is do some sort of physical phenomenon. So people use things like static noise or radioactive decay, and they measure radioactive decay. You could do something in the physical world and translate that into a number.
But you can't have a mathematical function which produces truly random outputs.
Correct. This is a not irrelevant digression. There is a lot of philosophy and theory and discussion about the sort of questions that your lordship has raised, and these are discussed at great length in the Knuth book that we'll look at. The Knuth book is the sort of philosophical tone when you want to have the sort of discussion about these sorts of matters, about what is truly random and how you can get things mimicking random and how well they can mimic random and so forth. I, of course, have mentioned, I gave an example of a period of 10 because it's easy to imagine a string of 10 numbers. You could have a period of, I mean, we'll see mentions of periods of 10, is it 10 to the 100? For example, I mean, you could have a period of 10 to the 100. So that's a 1 with 100 zeros after it, which is obviously a lot longer.
I think it's a Google, isn't it?
It is a Google, my lords. Spelt Googol. So I was going to show you how the invention uses an LCG to determine a starting point of a search space. And for that, please can we go to the patent in the supplemental bundle, tab 1, page 20. So the easiest way to explain this is to start with the second of these equations, xi equals. So xi is the output of the LCG. I is the subframe number. So we can see already that there'll be a different value of x for each subframe. Then A, B, and D are the multiplier, the increment, and the modulus of the LCG. And we saw the judge just explain what the increment, the multiplier, and the modulus are. And for this patent, those numbers are provided by claim 4. You can just glance over the next page. It gives you the values for D, A, and B. And in the equation xi minus 1 is the output of the previous iteration of the LCG. So to get the random number for subframe 4, which we would call x4, you input the random number from subframe 3, that's x3, multiply by a, add b, and then do mod d on that. And then for subframe 0, the first subframe, to calculate x0, you need a value for x minus 1, and the claim tells you to use the UEID for x minus 1. So the UEID is the seed for the LCG. And doing that means that each UE will get a different sequence of random numbers. So that equation, xi equals, etc., will give you 10 random numbers. And those 10 random numbers will be different for each UEID because the seed is different for each UEID.
Sorry, why did you say 10?
Well, because there are 10, you do it 10 times. xi, I is the subframe number.
Oh, because there are 10 subframes in a frame.
Yes, so you just do it 10 times. You don't need to know. So that you get x0 to x9. You don't need to know what x10 is. I mean, you could calculate x10 if you want, but there's no point. Then once you have your random number x for that subframe, lines 36 to 40 on this page tell you to do a mod C on that. And you see here C equals, and it's the same C as we saw in Ericsson, so it's floor of the number of CCEs divided by the aggregation level. LCCE is the aggregation level. So you get your random number xi for that subframe, and then you do mod C on that, and so that gives you a number from 0 to C minus 1, which is the starting point of the search space for that aggregation level. Now, I think it would be helpful to identify some similarities and differences between this function and the Ericsson function. So, at a close level of mathematical detail, both the patterns function and the Ericsson function, they have an x, but they're completely different things. Okay? But they both have an x in them. Both functions conclude with the same mod C operation. Okay, that's something they both look on. Both of them do mod C at the end to generate a starting point between 0 and C minus 1. But the patented function has two mod operations. So an LCG has a mod function within it. So that's the mod D in the claim. So that mod D is the mod that comes in an LCG, and then mod C is a subsequent step in the function which is not part of the LCG. And the Ericsson function only has one mod function, which is the mod C. At a conceptual level, there's a very big difference between the functions. Namely, that the patented function uses an LCG as the engine of the function to generate a series of random numbers. So whereas the Ericsson function is a conventional hashing function, it just takes an input called x, maps that to one of the possible starting points for the search space. The patented function instead uses a recursive random number generator to generate the sequence of random numbers. And because the seed is the UEID, each UE will have a different sequence of 10 random numbers unique to that UE. And then the UE can then use those random numbers, one in each subframe, to determine its own search space starting points. Remember, it will take the output of the LCG, so it will take xi, and do 4 mod C operations on that number. It'll do mod 1, mod 2, mod 4, mod 8.
Is that right? I thought you divided by 32.
Sorry? No, the 32 is NCCE.
Yes, but you don't do mod 1, 2, 4, and 8.
Yes, so C is 1, 2, 4, and 8.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Isn't it 32?
Yeah, I'm sorry, yes. No, I did misspoke. You do mod C. There are 4 different values of C. I'm sorry.
Which is 32, 16.
In that example, they were 32, 16,
8
and 4. Yes, in that specific example, yes. Sorry, I did say what your lordship accused me of saying. So you do mod C 4 different times, 4 different values of C. And that gives you 4 different searching, 4 different start points, one at each aggregation level. And unlike Ericsson, the Ericsson function, that does work properly to spread out the search spaces amongst UEs and from subframe to subframe, and as a result was accepted by round 1 as the solution to the problem and written into the AT standard. And I assume all your lordships have phones which are using it as we speak.
When you get to the next set of subframes, the next frame,
Yes.
you do the same calculation, you get the same answers.
You go back to yes. So your search.
So for each frame, your starting spaces for each subframe are going to be the same in the next frame.
Yes, indeed. So subframe 0, you're assuming the size of the PDCCH doesn't change, because of course the number of CCEs might be different in subframe 0 of the next frame. But assuming it's the same, it will be the same. But because you can't make that assumption, it won't necessarily be the same. But yes, one thinks of this we think of this in a frame basis. But yeah, the answer to your question is no, because the number of CCEs might be different in subframe 0 of the next frame.
So if everything was, assuming that nothing changed,
yes,
when you're going from frame to frame, if the sharing out of these options wasn't very good, that would keep recurring. But the point is that this is a good enough way of sharing out the functions in a frame. It doesn't matter that you keep doing the same thing every frame.
Correct. Correct.
You're going to come to this. One of the problems of Ericsson was that if you get a collision in one subframe, you can get it recurring into the next subframe. But that's between one subframe and the next. It's not between one set of subframes and the next set of subframes.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, that's what your lordship describes as what we call the lockstep problem, which we are coming to because it's important. So the use of a random number generator in a function like this was quite a departure from round 1. And I'm going to show you the factual findings on that in a moment. But the point I need to stress is that in making the invention, inventors constructed a bespoke LCG. And what I mean by that is that they selected the parameters for the LCG themselves. As we're going to see, it's possible to go to the books and find lots of suggested parameters for RNGs, including LCGs, and we call that an off-the-shelf solution. But the inventors of the patent did not use an off-the-shelf solution. They constructed a bespoke LCG, and that was not something that the skilled person had ever done. And that's what I want to show you in the judgment. So I'm in the core bundle, tab 6, page 90. So on page 90, there's a heading, Experience of RNGs stroke LCGs. And we rely on the findings of fact in paragraphs 113 and 114, which I'll come to in just a second. But unfortunately, at 115, the judge seriously misunderstood our submission. Our submission was that the skilled person had never had to create their own RNG or LCG. They'd never had to choose the parameters for an LCG or an RNG for a particular application. And that submission was made good because we'd thrown down the gauntlet in that respect. And Apple could not find a single example of a round 1 person or even a round 2 person actually devising their own RNG. And the evidence is in 113, 114, so let's look at that. So 113 is an example from round 2. And what you'll see is that they said we're going to use an RNG, but they left the RNG to the reader. It wasn't specified what RNG to use.
Is round 2 a separate work stream or a subsequent work stream?
No, a separate work stream operating at a different level of the a different layer of the protocol stack is the correct terminology. So I don't know whether your lordship's come across protocol stacks before.
Only in this judgment.
So it's a different task. If you think of like management, we're talking round one. So this is the physical layer that's actually sending things over the air, and the subsequent layers you can think of as being concerned with matters at high levels of abstraction. So round one and round two are closely related because they're consecutive. But the real point is that in this instance, round two said, okay, we'll use a random number generator here, but that doesn't need to be written into the standard. We don't need to write the actual random number generator into the standard. We'll leave that to whoever's making the phone. And the point is, this was not an example of a skilled person creating a bespoke RNG as opposed to using an off-the-shelf solution. We just don't know what the implementers actually do. So that example makes our submission good, that the skilled person would have no experience of making a bespoke RNG. And then the second example at paragraph 114 proved our point exactly. The second example is an example of a random number generator being written into the standard by round one. And what you can see is that they took it from a source called Numerical Recipes in C, NRC, which we're going to be discussing. They used the judge quotes them. It's stolen. So they've used an off-the-shelf solution from the books. They've taken the parameters from the book NRC instead of thinking what parameters shall we use. And you see that it says, Optis argues that this shows that the skilled person could only perform uncomprehending lifting of RNGs, LCGs from the literature. Well, that wasn't our submission. Our submission was much simpler, that the skilled person had never done anything other than taking an off-the-shelf solution. And that was an important attribute of the skilled person. And the judge just didn't factor that in because he misunderstood our submission. And this fact, the skilled person, if they've ever come across a random number generator, has only ever taken off-the-shelf solutions, highly relevant both to whether it would be obvious to use a random number generator and to the obviousness of Claim 4, which claims the bespoke parameters of the LCG.
When you talk about parameters, do you mean the values for A, B, and D?
Correct, yes.
Which are specified in Claim 4?
Which is specified in Claim 4, yes.
But not specified in Claim 1?
No, indeed. And as I say, we're talking now, when we look at these paragraphs of the judgment, we're talking about the attributes of the skilled person. And we say this attribute is relevant both to the question of whether they would use a random number generator or an LCG in particular, which is relevant to Claim 1, and it's relevant to whether the skilled person would develop the particular parameters that are claimed in Claim 4. Relevant to both of those, but one can see immediately why it's particularly pertinent to the second of those questions.
Do we have the function that was stolen from NRC?
It's not in these bundles. I can say, so the document, I'll just tell you the documents of trial. We had the actual standard, which of course just has the function in it. And then we also had the background document where the person said, this is the function we should write into the standard. And they noted on it, we've stolen this function from NRC. From NRC, yes. If your lordships want to see those, we'll make both of those available pages. As I say, stolen is the quotation from that second document. So, my lord, that was what I was going to say about the patented solution, and I was now going to come to the judge's steps to the invention. This is my fourth topic. Now, we set out the steps necessary to get from Ericsson to the invention in our appeal skeleton. That's in the core bundle on page 21. So, paragraph 13 sets out the steps to get to Ericsson. Sorry. Paragraph 13 sets out the steps to get from Ericsson to Claim 1 of the 953 patent. And then paragraph 14 sets out the additional steps to get to Claim 4 of the 953 patent. And we call these the judge's steps, but essentially they're the steps put forward by Apple through Professor Lozano, their expert. And they're his steps, and you'll find them in his report. I'm not going to go there now, but you'll find them in his report at paragraphs 201 to 220. And only in respect of one of Professor Lozano's steps did the judge make a slight modification, and you'll see that modification. It was a slight but important modification. Now, my submissions on the judge's errors are going to be structured around these steps. So we thought it would be convenient if your Lordship just has those same steps on a single sheet of paper, which we've done, as a convenient reference. And what we've done is what we should have done originally, which is number them all consecutively. So if the usher doesn't mind, if you wouldn't mind handing these up to the Lordships. So the text I'm handing you is identical text from the skeleton argument. There's nothing new here. It's just those steps numbered 1 to 11.
Thank you. If you wouldn't mind emailing it, Mr. Abrams, at some point. No hurry.
Of course, absolutely.
I'll lose it otherwise.
But if you want, your Lordship could also just write 1 to 11 by paragraphs 13 to 14. Now, of course, the first step is appreciating that the Ericsson function is flawed. That's step 1. After step 1, of course, none of these represent the actual chain of reasoning that led the inventors at LGE to the invention. This is a route constructed by Apple and Professor Lozano for the purpose of contending that there is a way to get from Ericsson to the patent without invention. So this is precisely the sort of a posteriori reconstruction that Lord Diplock warned about in Technograph, which is why, if I may say so, my Lord Justice Arnold's comment was particularly pertinent earlier about looking at Technograph, because it is more pertinent to this case than it usually is. And that is, the reason I make that point is because when I say that many of these steps are illogical, or unrealistic, or irrational, I'm not in any way criticising the inventors, because they just didn't go by this route at all. They did something completely different. And so the question is not whether the invention, what LGE did was rational. The question is whether this particular line of reasoning and thinking is rational. And that is precisely the Technograph point. Now, just to be clear, some of these steps we don't complain about per se, but they're included because they're an essential part of the judge's reasoning. Obviously, step 1 is in that category. And whereas in other cases, we say that the judge made an error in relation to the step that was sufficiently serious and material that it breaks the chain and vitiates the whole of the judge's reasoning. And obviously, because these steps build on one another, if one step fails, one step is not obvious, then that's the end of the chain and the end of the case. My Lord, you'll see one other point to make about these steps. You'll see at step 5, there's a reference to a book called Nuth. And then Nuth appears a couple more times in the steps, and we'll be discussing Nuth. Your Lordships need to be aware that Apple also argued at trial that the patent was obvious starting from Nuth, and the judge rejected that. The reason I'm telling you this is that Apple actually only pleaded pages 1 to 40 of volume 2 of Nuth. So that's about a third of the relevant chapter. Now, your Lordships have got the whole of that chapter in what I think is called Supplementary Appeal Bundle Volume 2. I hope it looks like that. But they pleaded only the first 40 pages of this. And it was clear that Professor Lozano had focused on that part and not taken the whole chapter into account. And I'm just mentioning that because we'll see that later. But the other parts post page 40 of Nuth are very, very relevant to these questions. And we'll be looking at them. So, my Lord, that was the 4th topic, which was the invention. And now the 5th topic is the judge's errors. And I wonder whether it might be a convenient moment for a break for the shorthand writer, just because we're about to come.
Well, we don't usually break for shorthand writers.
Fine.
Unless there's a pressing need.
Understood. So, 5th topic, the errors of the judge. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my submissions by reference to these steps, because they're just easier to understand the submissions if you go through the steps in that order. And then at the end, I'm going to address ground 6 of the grounds of appeal, which is the judge's failure to deal adequately with the steps as a whole. And your lordships have to understand each of the steps before I can make my submissions as to why we say the judge didn't consider them as a whole properly. So step 1 is identifying the flaws in Ericsson. The judge found that the skilled person would be able to identify the flaws in the Ericsson function without invention, and we don't challenge that finding in this court. But your lordships do need to know what are the flaws in the Ericsson function. So they're identified in the judgment at page 105, the core bundle. So this is paragraph 212. So the first problem, if you look at 212 Roman 1, that's the lockstep problem. The judge refers to it later as the lockstep problem. At 214, he refers to it as the lockstep problem. He doesn't actually say at 2121 that this is the lockstep problem, but that's what it is. And the point is that, as my lord mentioned a moment ago, if two UE search spaces at an aggregation level collide in one subframe, they'll collide in every subsequent subframe for the rest of the frame, assuming no change in the number of CCEs. And this problem with the Ericsson function arises because of the distributive property of the mod function, which the judge records in his 212 little Roman 1. And for reference, the distributive property of modular arithmetic he sets out at paragraph 135. So if you, and the point is, if you add two numbers again together and then mod them, that's the same as modding those two numbers separately, adding them together, and then modding the sum. And because of that, if two numbers collide, then in the next subframe, they'll collide again, because the only thing that increments, the only thing that changes, relevantly changes, is the subframe number incrementing by 1. The second flaw he identifies at little Roman 2, and that is that it doesn't work for c equals 16. And what the judge means by it doesn't work for c equals 16 is that whenever c equals 16, all the UEs have the same search space. And this arises also because of the distributive property of the mod function. So just if I may explain that. If you go to the Ericsson function, it's in page 86 of the supplemental bundle, or it's also in the judgment. It's probably easier just to go to the supplemental bundle, page 86. The reason it happens is this. You see that X is the UEID times 16 plus the subframe number. If you multiply a number by 16 and then do mod 16 on it, you get 0. So you multiply the UEID by 0 and then mod it, you get 0. So it doesn't matter what your UEID is. If you then do mod 16, that just sort of wipes out the UEID. So when C equals 16, doing mod C on X will always give you the subframe number.
Why is it a C equals 16 problem? Why isn't it a C equal 8 or C equals 4 problem?
Because it's particularly a C equals 16 problem because you're multiplying the UEID by 16, and so you're just in X. But if you
in mod 8,
Yes.
UE by 16 will still produce a remainder of 0. And same with mod 4 and same in mod 2. So you'll still just get the same subframe number. You'll still get the same output.
C equals 16 was the one that was particularly spotted and discussed at trial. I think your lordship is probably right. You'll certainly. I mean, I was going to say mod 32 would also cause the problem. No, but you could have. I'll think about that. It certainly arises at C equals 16. It may arise in those situations as well. It can only help me more if it does. But it's certainly when C equals 16, the Ericsson function doesn't work because mod x will just be the subframe number, and multiplying by kx plus L won't change that, won't make a difference because of the distributive properties of modular arithmetic. So at least for C equals 16, every UE will be mapped to the same search space starting point. And that's the second problem. And just for completeness, the third point in paragraph 212 is not actually a third flaw. It's just the judge's statement that by performing simulations, you would find out these problems. So those are the flaws with the Ericsson function. I was going to move on, unless your lordship has any more questions. I was going to move on to step 2. So you put the supplemental bundle to one side for a moment. Step 2 is splitting the Ericsson function into a kx plus L part and a mod C part, and deciding that the problem lies in the kx plus L part, and so deciding to modify that part and only that part. Now, this step is crucial because all the next steps are built on the assumption that the skilled person is looking to replace kx plus L but keep mod C. So it's absolutely critical to do this at this stage for the Apple's chain of reasoning. Now, the judge addressed this in his judgment starting at paragraph 221. So paragraph 222 contains Apple's submissions. So their position that they would realise that the mod C part of the Ericsson function was there to squeeze the random output of the kx plus L part down from a large number to a range from 0 to C minus 1. And this is the crucial bit, that the mod C part was therefore necessary and was working all right, and that any change should therefore be to the random kx plus L part. And then the judge refers to Professor Lozano's oral evidence, and then at 225 you see he accepts this. Okay? So he accepts the submission in 222. And 223 to 224 contain the two key points of reasoning. And if I can summarise the reasoning in 223 and 224. First, Professor Lozano is saying that a hashing function has two purposes. First, he said, was to map a large number of inputs to a smaller number of outputs, which he referred to as the squeezing process. So that's squeezing the various numbers down to a number between 0 and C minus 1. And then the second is to randomise the mappings, so similar inputs do not get mapped to similar outputs. And he says that's what kx plus L is doing. And then the second element of reasoning, which is you see particularly in 224, although it's also in the end of 223, is that Professor Lozano is saying that the mod C part of the Ericsson function is fine. What needs editing is the kx plus L part and only that part. So that's the submission of Apple, which the judge accepted. And it's the second of these points that we say is flawed, and I mean really flawed, and which the judge was wrong to accept. And we make 3 points in support of that submission. First, and this is a context point, your lordships should be aware that this second point was something that Professor Lozano came up with for the first time in the witness box. So his written evidence for reference, and we will be looking at this, is, well, no, actually, perhaps we ought to look at it in fairness. It's in the supplemental bundle, page 116, tab 8. So on page 116, at paragraph 206, he makes the first point that kx plus L is providing the randomness, and that mod C is doing the squeezing down to get a number between 0 and C minus 1. And then at 210, he simply says, once the skilled person had verified that not all the desired properties are met, they would look to replace kx plus L with a random number generator having the desired properties. At no point does he say that's because the kx plus L part is working fine and the mod, excuse me, at no point does he say that's because the mod C part is working fine and the kx plus L part is the problem. He just says that's what you would do. So,
Well, just help me on that.
sorry.
In 210, he says they would look to replace kx plus L,
Yes.
but is it not implicit in that they're not looking to replace mod C?
And it is, certainly. But no, absolutely, it is implicit in that. Absolutely. But what he hasn't done is he hasn't said that the problems with the Ericsson function lie in the kx plus L part. And he hasn't said, oh, the mod C part, that's working fine, as he did in his oral answers quoted by the judge. And I'll just give you that point for context. This is context for my next submissions.
So is it is the point you're making this, that he does say that you would, a skilled person would look to replace the kx plus L part, but he doesn't give the reasons which you say he gave in his oral?
Correct. That's all. That's all. So we do say that the reasons he gave, particularly quoted in 224, is an ex post facto justification for an ex post facto justification. And now I move to my second point, which is, as often happens when one thinks of things on one's feet, they turn out just to be wrong. The judge's finding that the problem with the Ericsson function lay in the kx plus L part and that the mod C part was working all right is demonstrably false from the face of the judgment. Now we looked at the Ericsson function. As a matter of school child mathematics, you can see that x will be a unique number for every UE and every subframe. And therefore kx plus L will be a unique number for every UE and every subframe. So if we consider the first flaw in the Ericsson function, the lockstep problem, that only arises after the application of mod C. And indeed the judge at 212 Roman 1 specifically said that the lockstep problem was caused by the distributive properties of modular arithmetic. So it is the mod C that is the problem, or at least part of the problem. Even on the face of the judgment. The second flaw with the Ericsson function, the C equals 6, what we call the C equals 16 problem, all UEs have the same starting position. As I said, the result of kx plus L is always going to be a unique number for every UE. And it's the mod C operation which maps all these unique numbers into the same number whenever C equals 16. And those are just basic mathematical facts which the judge himself recognised in 212. So it's simply impossible to conclude from that that the mod C part is fine and all the problems all lie in the kx plus L part. At the very least, the problem with Ericsson's function, the problems with the Ericsson function are due to the interaction of the two elements of the function. So it's utterly unrealistic to simply split the function into parts and decide that one part's inviolable and the other part, and only that part, should be considered for amendment. The only reason to do that is if one's aiming for the invention.
This is not a criticism, but it would help us if, as you go along, you could give us references periodically to where we are in your grounds of appeal. There's no obligation on counsel to argue the case in the same order as the grounds of appeal. Sometimes it's more convenient to argue the case in a different order. But nevertheless, it's helpful for the court when writing a judgment to know which submission relates to which ground.
I will do that. So step 2, which is what we're on, is ground 3. And then at the and I'll do that for each step, and then at the very end, I'll just go through the grounds 1 and do ground equals step.
Fine, thank you.
Someone will remind me to don't forget to do that.
Did the professor mean any more than this? That you've got, in the mod 16 case, you've got 16 possible outputs. And that's the number of outputs you want, because you've got 16 possible subframe spaces. I can't remember the term, but 16 possible starting points within that subframe. And all he's saying is, so if you're trying to take a very large number of inputs and end up with 16 possible outputs, the way to do it is use a mod 16 function. Well, that's fine.
I've got, so the third, I said I'd make 3 points on this. The third point addresses what your lordship's just asked me directly.
And the problem, as you say, is the interaction with that, because if your input number is of the form 16a plus b, which it is, and the variability which only comes from the UE number is all in the A part and not in the B part, you're always going to get the same output, whatever your input, because you're using mod 16 or mod 8 or mod 4.
But indeed, so the problem, this is my third point that I'm about to come to, but in short, the problem is due to doing a mod function on that number. But there's no reason why you have to do a mod function. There are other things you can do to get from your big number to your number between 0 and c minus 1. And the flaw is to say, the flaw is to say, no, I'm going to keep the mod c, even though that is implicated in the problem. Or more particularly, the flaw is to say, the mod c is working fine, and that justifies me leaving the mod c in place, when it doesn't. Now, if I've understood your lordship's question correctly, another justification in theory could be, well, you've got to have something to get from a big number to a value between 0 and c minus 1, but you don't have to do mod c. So let me develop that.
Yes.
Let me develop that. So this is our third point, because we are complaining about the judge accepting the submission that the mod c part was necessary. So I've said, so in 222, Apple's case was mod c was therefore necessary and was working all right. And the judge appeared to accept that. And I've said the judge was factually wrong to say it was working all right. And now I'm addressing it's just factually wrong to say it's necessary. Nobody was saying that it was necessary, and it's demonstrably false. And Professor Lozano's evidence on that was to the contrary. So I should show you that, since your lordship asked me that question. So if your lordship goes to tab 14 of the bundle, sorry, supplemental bundle. So it's bundle page 169. So I'm on page 266 of the transcript, if your lordships are with me. And we were discussing this squeezing down or squishing down. And if your lordships could read 266 line 16 to 267 line 2. So what's happening here is at line 19, I was putting to the professor, you don't have to use a mod C function for the squeeze in. And I put to him a particular technique for doing it. And he, not only did he agree with it, he said at line 24, or you could do other things. You could use any function whose outputs go from 0 to 1. And there are many such functions. You just pick the simplest one. You're talking about 0 to 1 because then if you multiply by C, then you get your range. So not only is mod C not necessary, but there are many such other functions. And just so that your lordship understands that bit of cross-examination, if your lordship goes to the judgment, page 2, paragraph 268. Here the judge is dealing with what we call step 7. And he's saying here, 268, that Optis argued it would not be obvious to use mod C to convert the result to a value between 0 and C minus 1 for a reason which we'll come to. And they say at the end, the alternative is to convert the output of the LCG to a number between 0 and 1 by dividing by the modulus of the LCG, multiplying by C, and taking the integer part. That was the specific method that I was putting to the professor in the bit of cross-examination that I put to him. So the judge recognises at this stage that there is an alternative to mod C, which I think is your lordship, the answer to your lordship's question. And indeed it went further because the professor said there were lots of other reasons in addition to this alternative. And then at paragraph 270, the judge recognises that a mod operation is not always a suitable way of squeezing down a large value into a specified range. So that's the middle of 270. He says, I do not think there are simple alternatives, in fact, because clearly there are instances where using mod C is suboptimal. And we're going to come to why it's suboptimal. And we'll see in the book there are warnings against using mod C. But the point I'm making here is there's absolutely no reason of necessity to keep mod C at this stage in the analysis when modular arithmetic is implicated in the problems with Ericsson, at the very least, if not the actual villain of the piece. And there are alternatives. So it's simply irrational and illogical to say at this stage, right, I'm just going to keep mod C and just look to replace the kx plus L part. And the judge just missed all of these points.
Well, you say it's irrational and illogical, but why is it not something that a skilled person might decide to do? The question is whether it's an obvious thing to do.
So that's one needs to be key about this. I'm not saying that the skilled person would have concluded that the function could not have a mod C in it. Okay? I'm not saying that it's irrational to end up with mod C in your function. But the chain of reasoning depends on making a decision at this stage to keep mod C and explore alternatives to kx plus L. That's what step 2 is. And that is what's irrational. And it does matter to Apple's chain of reasoning accepted by the judge that you make this decision at the outset. Mod C is fine, kx plus L, that's the bit I need to change. And it's that decision at this stage of the analysis. As I say, I'm not submitting that it's irrational to, at the end of your analysis, decide on a new function that has mod C in it. Or it's not irrational to not reject mod C. It's irrational to proceed with this specific chain of reasoning, based as it is on factually wrong statements, such as the mod C is doing fine and it's necessary. So that's my submission on step 2.
But part of the point you're making is this, right, Mr. Abrams, is that it's, I'm not trying to put words into your mouth. Are you accepting that it's apparent that you need an answer in the end, which will be between the range of 0 to C? But the point you're making is you don't have to decide to bank mod C at this point in the reasoning to get.
I would adopt those words if I may, Arnold. and we will see. Well, let me tell you the two reasons why banking C, they need you to bank mod C. The first is so that the next step is just focused on KX plus L specifically. Secondly, later, you'll see warnings against mod C, and they need mod C to be in the bank at that stage, because when we get to, and it's step 7, when we get to step 7, unless mod C is banked, you wouldn't contemplate it at that stage. We'll see that. So now I'm moving on to step 3 in the analysis. Step 3 is deciding to replace the KX plus L part with a random number generator. And your lordships can see how that assumes you're banking mod C, otherwise why are you going down that particular route? And my lord, this is the subject of grounds of appeal 1 and 4. Now, the judge addressed this starting at paragraph 228 on page 109. And it's under the heading Literature Search on page 109 of the judgment. But you can see from 228 that before such a literature search begin, there must be a prior decision to use a random number generator. If you look at 228, he's looking in the literature for an appropriate RNG. So you have to decide to replace KX plus L with an RNG before you do your literature search. So I'm focusing now on the decision to replace KX plus L with a random number generator prior to embarking on literature search. Now, it's an undeniable fact that a hashing function and a random number generator are different things. And I've already shown your lordships paragraph 88 of the judgment, which describes a hashing function as a function used to map data of arbitrary size to a range of fixed values. And the judge identified the goal of a hashing function at paragraph 120, sub 2. And the judge, quite rightly, and I don't shrink away from this, said that a way that a hashing function spreads out evenly may be achieved by mimicking a random spread. Okay, so there is that connection between a random number generator and a hashing function. A random number generator, so that's a hashing function, mapping an input, which in the context of a hashing function is called a key, to a single output value. And obviously the idea is that the same output is achieved for the same key on every occasion. But it's a one-to-one function, one key input, one mapping output.
And is it, my understanding is, and I don't know if this right, that the reason, or a reason you want to do that is so that a small change in the key doesn't produce a small change in the hash.
Correct.
Which means you would be able, so if you're using hashing to spot tampering, small change would lead to a completely different hash number.
That's one of the aspects of the hashing function, certainly. Absolutely. And a random number generator, on the other hand, the purpose of it is to generate a series of random numbers, or more strictly pseudo-random numbers. And it has a seed to start it going, but it's self-sustaining because each output is fed back in as the next input. So one can see that the purpose of a random number generator is quite different to the purpose of a hashing function.
I'm sorry, I haven't understood why you want your hashing function to produce random outputs.
Yeah.
Why don't you just produce linear output? I mean, if you want to, for each input, have a different output, if you have 10 people, you put the first one in house 1, the second one in house 2, and the third one in house 3. Why do they have the first one have to go to house 7 and the second one to house 4?
One can do that. That's not, that sort of function either wouldn't work in the Ericsson context or wouldn't, or isn't available in the Ericsson context. I think the reason is because you don't, that sort of approach won't necessarily produce an even spread. unless you've got some way of deciding in advance where everybody's going to go. You don't know you don't know which of the large values. So you don't know which of your 1,000 pupils in your school are going to be having to be allocated into houses, but you've only got 5 houses. So a deterministic rule like that, you might end up with an uneven spread.
Well, I haven't understood. I'm sorry, I'm being very slow. I haven't understood why. If you're the variability in the input is solely in the UE number.
Yeah.
If your UE numbers are consecutive, the first cell phone in the cell gets number 1, and the second one gets number 2. Why don't you give the first one the starting point number 1, and the second one starting point number 2?
That won't work, because if you do that, number 3 will then leave the cell. Number 5 will join this, then the new one will come with number 5. And you can't stick to 1 to, if you've got 10 in the cell, you can't stick to 1 to 10, because when the 11th arrives, they'll be given number 11, then number 2 will leave. Then the next one arrives and he's given number 12. And it just doesn't work that way. That would also pose a constraint on the selection, on the allocation of UEID numbers, which may not be consistent with the rest of the I mean, I'm arguing against myself in a sense, because I'm accepting that in this context you want a hashing function to do an even spread, and the way in this context to do an even spread is by mimicking randomness. And it was well known that that's one way in which a hashing function could achieve randomness, particularly when you don't know which of the inputs you're going to get. So there are just over 65,000 possible UEIDs, and I don't think you can just ensure that they're done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on. Not least because mobiles are coming in and out of the cell all the time.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, I'll leave it there, but I'm afraid I haven't understood it.
Okay. Well, perhaps
suppose you've got 65,000
yes.
UEIDs and you want to allocate them all different starting points. Why don't you just take 60, whatever their UEID is, and just take mod C of that? What would be wrong with that? That would distribute them.
Well, that wouldn't give you different distribution in each subframe.
Well, I understand that.
Why don't you just do mod C of that? Because that would only work if you did allocate the UEIDs either consecutively or randomly, and that would be an additional constraint. The RAN, I mean, it may well be. It may the risk of speculation. It may well be that RAN 1 is not allowed to set rules about the allocation of UEIDs, because UEIDs are, yeah. I'll leave it at that. I don't know whether they could do that. My Lord, it's Mr. White pointed out that, my Lord Justice Birss, your point about small change in the input leading to a big change in the output. That's actually a point made in the Wikipedia page about hash functions, which is in the supplemental bundle at page 95. They make precisely that point, and other points about. The other answer, my Lord, to your question about is you have to come up with a scheme that works for any aggregation level. How that fits in, I can't immediately say, but that is a complexity. And you want to have a different spread at each aggregation level, so it may be that the answer is you need more randomness than that. So I was making the point that the purpose of a hashing function and the purpose of a random number generator is just different.
I mean, I've lived a very sheltered life, Mr. Abrams, but I've never seen a hashing function used in the way that Ericsson's proposing it. Was that a standard way of using hashing functions?
Well, in the sense, at a level of generality, a hashing function maps a large number of inputs to a small number of outputs. So in that case, the number of inputs is all the UEs.
No, I understand how it works.
Yes.
Fine, don't worry.
I can't. Nobody thought that was nobody suggested that was a very unusual use of a hashing function. Certainly, and perhaps it's
Is there
irrelevant.
any clue in the fact that the words hashing function are put in inverted commas in the first time the expression is used?
Yeah, I mean, I can't.
It's a slightly loose use of the language. It might be said.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, that, as I say, that particular point that we're discussing wasn't explored at trial. I can tell your lordships, if it's relevant, that it was back in 2007, in around the middle of 2007, that the hashing function was first proposed for this process at an earlier round one meeting. It was suggested at that stage, without actually specifying what the function would be. The idea of using a quote hashing function unquote had been around in round one for some months, and then Ericsson, I believe I'm right in saying, was the first time they went down to a concrete, right, this is the function, these are the inputs, and this is how you calculate the mapping. So, but whether it's an unusual use or not, it's a very different use from a random number generator, which is to generate random numbers, and it's reflected, for example, in the fact that a random number generator is recursive in a way that a hashing function simply isn't. Now, the judge made some points about the relationship between hashing functions and random number generators in paragraphs 118 to 121 of the judgment, which I think should be open in front of your lordships now. And nothing in paragraph 120 contradicts any of the points that I've just made. So the judge made a number of points about hashing functions, random number generators, but it doesn't contradict the points I've made about the differences. So the conclusion at 121 is that they're not separate and distinct because they both involve the use of randomization. But the existence of that similarity doesn't stop them being different beasts. They remain separate concepts, despite the fact that they both use or may use randomization. And the error comes when the judge then takes that conclusion, in his conclusion in 121, and applies it in 228 to 231, which is where he deals with step 3. And effectively, what the judge says at 228 to 231 is that because at a high level, these two mathematical concepts have something in common, one can just be substituted for the other. And that involves a large gap in logic and is flawed. And I make two specific points. Firstly, obviously, the trite point that just because mathematical concepts are related doesn't mean it's obvious to use one in place of the other. Nobody had ever used a random number generator to drive a hashing function or as a means of generating the randomness necessary for a hashing function. And no doubt that's because of the differences I've just outlined. And when I say nobody had ever thought of these things, I mean nobody could find an example in any field. The second point is that this step is not even the use of a random number generator in substitution for a hashing function. I mean, it would be one thing if the judge had said, well, you can, one or the other, you pick and choose. What Professor Lozano was doing, and the judge agreed to, is surgically dissecting the Ericsson function and transplanting an RNG in place of one of its elements. And the result is then that the RNG operates within the hashing function. And that's what I mean when I say it becomes its engine. It generates the randomness for the hashing function. And that's an extremely clever idea. But that specific idea is not justified by anything in the judge's paragraphs 118 to 121 or 228 to 231. The judge just simply says, well, they've both got an element of randomness in them, an aspect of randomness in them, so why not? And it's not justified by anything in the prior art, obviously, which we've looked at, and it's not justified by anything in the common general knowledge, for nobody had ever thought of doing anything like this before LGE did it. We looked at various sources of hashing functions, and nobody had ever thought of having a hashing function which, instead of working on a one key input to one output basis, instead harnessed an RNG in this way to generate a sequence of outputs as a way of achieving randomness. It was an entirely new concept. That submission I need to make good by showing you the source on hashing that we looked at the most, which is Knuth on hashing. So that's not this chapter 3. It's in the supplemental bundle at tab 18. So this is a different volume of Knuth to the section on random numbers.
I'm sure I've read it somewhere, but can you remind me how many volumes were there?
Well, this is volume 3, and I think there were only 3.
Right. Okay.
3. So we're now volume 3, chapter 6, and section 6.4 on page 184 is hashing.
Do we know what date this is?
Oh, there's a complication there. This edition that we're looking at is...
This is the second edition. Am I right in remembering it's 1981?
Yes. The volumes came out close to each other, but not exactly the same year.
Ah, right. So volume 2 was 81, I think.
Yes. Volume 2 was 81, and there was another edition in 97 of volume 2, but the pleaded version was the 81 version. So at trial we used the 81 version, although it's not different from the 97 version.
The index on the bundle says it's 1998. The index on the electronic bundle,
I would have thought that's right. So this must be the. Okay, I will check that and get back to you. The volumes came out.
The index also says that for volume 2, certainly the bit you were using, it's 1981.
Yes, that is correct, because that was the pleaded version. So volume 2, we used the 1981 version at trial, even though there was a 1997 version. And that's because that's the version that Apple relied on. Anyway, this is all well before the priority date. So this is the section on hashing. On page 185, in the first full paragraph that begins these considerations, they discuss what hashing is talking about, and they say the idea in hashing is to scramble some aspect of the key and to use this partial information as the basis for searching. So put that way, it sounds like the Ericsson function is using a hashing function in a conventional way. Have you?
Sorry, where are you?
So I'm on page 185 by the second hole punch. It says the verb to hash means to chop something up and make a mess of it. The idea in hashing is to scramble some aspects of the key and to use this partial information as the basis for searching. We compute a hash address H brackets K and begin searching there. So when they say a hashing address, so K is the key and HK is the output of the hashing function. So in this chapter you see HK equals, and that's giving you a hashing function. Yeah. And you see at the equation 1 at the bottom of the page that the output will be within a certain range between 0 and n. That's the point. The point about a hashing function is that you're constrained. And they use the number m to illustrate the constraint. Now, all these hashing functions, all of Knuth's hashing functions are, of course, standard hashing functions. And you've got on page 187, you've got an example at 4 of a suggested hashing function with some inputs. We don't need to get into the inputs. M, obviously, we know is the range, and K is the key. But of course, there is absolutely nothing like the patented invention in which a random number generator is used as an engine inside a hashing function to create the randomness. And this was a very important point, and the judge just simply didn't take on board the significance of the fact. There is just not a single hint that a random number generator can be used in that way. Now the judge...
So the judge says there's a cross...
Yes, that's literally the next thing I'm about to mention. So
Yeah.
they are page 186. Chapter 3 is name checked twice on this page. So in the first paragraph, it's the... Well, perhaps if you read the first... You'll see it in the first 2 paragraphs, the 2 references.
Is this about, what I haven't quite understood is why this book is talking about hashing in this context. This is talking about how to do searches in databases using hashing for that.
Which is the conventional use of hashing. You've got a number of keys and you've got to put them somewhere in a database. And it was absolutely accepted that this chapter was applicable to the problem at hand. The judge...
So I don't understand what you meant. It may not matter very much. Why are you putting keys in a database? But I don't think it matters.
I was just agreeing with what your lordship said. If I said something different, all I was trying to do was say your lordship is right.
Okay.
So the judge mentioned those cross-references at paragraph 120, sub 5 of the judgment. I think that's what my lord was looking at.
Yes.
And you see he refers to Ms. Dwyer accepting that the direction was to look at the chapter at random numbers in connection with getting the hashing function whose overall output was random. Now I should show you that evidence. That's in the supplemental bundle, tab 16, page 181. If you've got page 181 of the supplemental bundle, it's page 454 of the transcript. Lines 5 to 19. Now that doesn't take one very far, but my real point is that the judge ignored the much more significant evidence on that, which is, if your lordships go back to page 161, we're now in Professor Lozano's evidence, and his evidence about the cross-references is at 215, line 17, to 216, line 8. that is the key point on this. That there's no suggestion in Knuth or anywhere, in fact, of using an LCG or any other sort of recursive function within a hash function. And he said no. And what all this goes to is the complete lack of realism in the step identified by the judge in 228. The Ericsson function was avowedly a hashing function, and there was plenty in the literature to help with hashing functions. And there was nothing in the CGK or the literature to suggest that an RNG could be used within a hashing function, and nobody had ever done it before. So why is the skilled person looking in the literature for random number generators and not looking for hashing functions? It can only come from hindsight, but it certainly doesn't come from the prior art. And it certainly doesn't come from anything in the CGK. And it certainly doesn't come from anything in Professor Lozano's evidence. I showed you paragraph 210 of Professor Lozano's evidence. He just simply says, you look in the books for a random number generator. That's it. No consideration of other avenues, no consideration of doing the normal thing, which would be to look for hashing functions. Just proceeding on rails towards the invention.
Sorry, Mr. Abrams, I understand that latter point you're making, but I'm now confused. I don't understand what it was, why it was that Knuth is referring to random numbers. Your submission seems to be that it doesn't make sense.
No,
but it obviously did.
No, it does make sense. It does make sense. I'm
coming to it. Fine.
No. Well, let me just tell you in a sentence. Knuth chapter 3 is about randomness as a general topic, and I'm going to show you in a moment. Give you an overview of Knuth chapter 3, so you can see it's not just about random number generators, and certainly not just about LCGs. And the point is that although there's a general reference to randomness in chapter 3, it's not
volume 3.
There's a reference to chapter 3 in chapter 6.
Okay. Right. We're talking about chapter 6.
Yes.
Chapter 6 refers to using random numbers. It's talking about hashing functions, and it's talking about random numbers.
Indeed.
Why?
Because one of the ways in which a hashing function can work is by providing a pseudo-random spread of the keys amongst the outputs as a way of spreading them, evenly. That's the point that the judge is making in paragraphs 120, little 2 and little 3.
Yes.
But there is a gap between a hashing function seeking to spread the keys evenly and randomly amongst the outputs and using a random number generator, that specific mathematical tool, within your hashing function as the way of generating the randomness. And that latter was something that nobody had ever done before, and there was simply no reason why the skilled person would make that conceptual leap. And the way the judge made the conceptual leap was simply by saying, well, because they both involve randomness, then what Professor Lozano says makes sense. But there's just all the difference in the world between two different sorts of tasks, both of which involve randomness in some respect.
All right, well, can I put the same question in a different and highly simplistic way?
Yes.
Do I understand you to be saying that while it is true that chapter 6 of Knuth cross-refers to chapter 3 of Knuth, and says you can look there for randomness, it doesn't cross-refer to any particular specific part of chapter 3, still less does it say go to the bit of chapter 3 where I teach you about RNGs, still less does it say go to the bit of chapter 3 where it says I teach you about LCGs.
Precisely.
Okay.
Precisely. And since
Just that point I think I've understood.
I know you said precisely, Mr. Abrams, but it does, the cross-reference does say random number generator, so I think you were a bit enthusiastic to agree with that.
Yes, but it's not saying...
Because it does say random number.
Sure, but it's certainly not saying... It's not saying those random number generators are a technique that you can use within your hashing function, and that was the reason I showed you Professor Lozano's evidence, because I did give him an opportunity to say, yes, there is a hint, I think I used the word hint, suggestion. I did give him an opportunity to say there is something in Knuth on hashing that would suggest to you this idea of using a random number generator as the engine of your hashing function. And he said no.
Well, I think you need to show us that.
That was the bit I was just... That's 216 of the transcript. So it's page 162 of the supplemental bundle. Page 2, and I say, there is no suggestion in this chapter of Knuth, or in chapter 3 of Knuth, of using an LCG or any other sort of recursive function within a hash function, is there? No, it just refers to chapter 3 for randomization. That is where the LCG appears, i.e. it appears in chapter 3. And I was now going to just give you an overview of chapter 3 so that your worship can see what a point that...
Can I, just before we do that, go back to page 186 in chapter 6 and the 2 sentences you showed us. It's theoretically impossible to define a hash function that creates truly random data. That's because it's deterministic. But in practice, it's not difficult to produce a pretty good imitation by using simple arithmetic, as we have discussed in chapter 3. Now, when he says, as we have discussed in chapter 3, he's not saying use the techniques we've told you about in chapter 3. He's simply saying, when you read chapter 3, we told you you can use simple arithmetic, and here, when we come to the hashing functions, we can also use division and multiplication to produce a pretty good imitation of random data. Is that what he's saying?
That's exactly what he's saying, and you'll see when we look at the headings of chapter 3 that chapter 3 is about the theory of random numbers. Let me do that now, Arnold. But
do we have to read it all?
All of this? No. I just wanted to show you the subheadings, just so that your lordships understand that it is not just a chapter on LCGs or random number generators.
So we need volume 2.
Yes. So, I mean, your lordship... And I'm going to use the internal page numbers, because so that's at the top of the page, because those are the ones, then you may be able to link them to the evidence. So page 1 is about random numbers. So just the point that my Lord Justice Nugee was putting to me. The scope of the chapter is not simply LCGs or even RNGs. 3.1 is the introduction section. Then page 9, that's the 3.2 is the section on random number generators. You see, in this section we will consider methods for generating a sequence of random fractions. He's going to do them uniformly between 0 and 1. And on that page, 3.2.1 is about LCGs. Then on page 25...
Sorry, I couldn't find that.
Sorry.
Am I in the right place? I'm in supplemental volume 2?
Yes.
Right.
Sorry, I'm using the page numbers at the top of the page, if I may.
Oh, right. That's
Sorry.
what I didn't hear. I thought you were using the ones at the bottom.
Sorry, I said that too quickly. Sorry, I'm just doing that because so that
All right.
it matches.
All right. Just need to know which numbers. Okay.
So at the top, so page 9 is about generating uniform random numbers.
Right.
3.2.1 is the section on LCGs. Then page 25 at the top is about section 3.2.2 is other methods. That's other random number generators. Then page 38 is section 3.3 statistical tests. This is about ways of testing whether a set of allegedly random numbers are indeed random. So, of course, you can apply these tests to your hashing function to see if it is producing an even spread. Yes. It's to see whether our main purpose is to obtain sequences that behave as if they are random. So this is to test whether or not your numbers do indeed imitate random numbers. Then that's actually the bulk of the chapter, because the next section is on page 114. And this is other types of random quantities. and this includes at section 3.4.1, numerical distributions. This is about how to turn the output of a random number generator into a random integer within a given range. So we're going to be coming back to that. And then on page 142 is a heading about random sequences. And this is all about the theory and philosophy and engages with some of the questions that my Lord Justice Nugee put to me at the beginning of the day about whether it is possible to actually do randomness at all. And then, and this is really what's being referred to in Newton hashing when it says we've seen from chapter 3 it's possible to do an imitation, because this is discussing how you can, although a computer is deterministic, nevertheless it can do an imitation of random numbers. And then finally, page 170 is a summary for completeness, which we will also be coming to. So that's, once you've seen that, it will hopefully be clearer why we say that, as was put to me, that these references to chapter 3 are about the concept of randomness at that sort of level, and they are not, as Professor Lozano accepted, about suggesting the idea of using random number generators in the context of hashing functions.
Now, I appreciate you're coming to this later, but since you're giving us this overview of chapter 3, could you just point me to where we find table 13 within this?
Table 13. Oh, it's page. Do you mean? I think you mean table 1 on page 13.
Possibly.
Page 13 at the top of the page. I think that's the table you're referring to.
Yes, I think that is what I had in mind. Thank you.
So those are my submissions on the conceptual leap from a hashing function to the idea of using a random number generator within a hashing function as its engine, as I put it, which really was that. I mean, that really was one of the most clever aspects of what LGE did. The next step is step 4, which is the literature search. This is addressed within both ground 4 and ground 3E. Let me just explain what we say about the literature search. Your lordships might think it would be perfectly logical for a skilled person who'd read Ericsson and appreciated its flaws to do a literature search for a better function. And of course we agree. And our point is the one I've just made, which is that a person who's trying to find a better function in light of Ericsson, if they did a literature search, would do a literature search for hashing functions. The real point on step 4 is where it appears in the order of steps. And that's a point that's more conveniently addressed at the end of my submissions under the heading of ground 6. But essentially what we're saying is that it's rather odd to do the literature search here after you've already made some pretty fundamental decisions. And that's clearly driven by hindsight, because if you don't make those fundamental decisions first, you end up doing a literature search that, from Apple's point of view, is the wrong one.
Well, I appreciate you're going to come back to this, but at first blush that seems to be a bit odd, because no scientist does an undirected literacy search for the very obvious reason you don't know what you're searching for, and it would take forever and you would produce a billion hits. So you have to define the parameters of your literature search, and that involves thinking about the problem. So you need to define your problem in order to scope your literature search.
So put that way, effectively, the step 4 collapses into step 3, as it were. if I'm right about what I say about step 3, that it requires hindsight to think of this idea of using an RNG, then I'm right about the literature search. And if it doesn't require hindsight to think of an RNG, then obviously then doing a literature search at that stage is less objectionable. So that's what effectively the lordship is doing. But our submission under step 3, which also applies to step 4, is the problem facing you is find a better hashing function. That's really clear from Ericsson.
Well, one might characterise it in different ways. So one characterisation of the problem might be find a better hashing function. Another might be find an alternative to a hashing function. And I appreciate your argument is either way is good enough for your purposes.
Yes, I mean, we do say that if you look at Ericsson, what Ericsson says is it says we've decided on a hashing function. It actually says just check. It actually says verify that we get the right properties from that function. That there's no suggestion of anything other than a hashing function. So
well,
I think that's my question.
okay. So let me put the question a different way. So as I understand it, you accept that an obvious thing to do, starting from Ericsson, is find a better hashing function.
Absolutely.
Right. Do you dispute that another obvious thing to do would be to try and to come up with something else which was not a hashing function and would serve the purpose?
Well, at that high level of generality, I don't dispute it. Of course, remember the target is the specific chain of steps with which the judge addressed. So I hope that answers your lordship's question.
Do I understand it that this is a presentation given to the participants in round 1, and then they're told to go away and see if it works, and they all went away and rapidly came to the conclusion it didn't work, and then people started thinking about other solutions? Is that...
Everything except for the penultimate thing. Only a few people noticed that it didn't work. We had an argument at trial about whether it was how difficult it was to spot that it didn't work. The judge found that the skilled person would realise that it didn't work. So what happened was that some people said it didn't work. When it became clear, when they told everyone else it didn't work, then lots of people came up with solutions of all different sorts. And one of them, and only one of them, involved using a random number generator. And that was LG, and that was the one that was selected. All of them came up with hashing. They were all hashing functions. So they all came up with hashing functions that were all conventional one-in, one-out hashing functions, except for LG, which came up with this completely novel idea of using a random number generator as the engine. And that was all.
Is that evidence? I mean, I don't think it's before us, but is that evidence relevant to an assessment of how obvious it is to think about using?
The judge thought not. At trial, it was relied on heavily. The judge thought not. He summarised it in his paragraph 292 or 3, and he thought it wasn't relevant. And the main reason he said it. One of the main reasons he said it wasn't relevant is because this all took place over a compressed period of time. So he said, I can't say that the skilled person wouldn't have come up with this invention eventually. The fact that nobody else came up with it within that period of time doesn't tell me whether a skilled person working carefully and methodically wouldn't have come up with it. So that's why we don't feel able to rely on that evidence in this court, because the judge assessed it and said it's not helpful in that way. At trial, we certainly pointed out that every single function that was identified by every single other person who put forward a replacement was a conventional hashing function where you took a key and mapped it to an output. It starts at paragraph 278 of the judgment where he deals with this. And he gives a very potted summary of the evidence on this. And so for example, he notes that not everybody spotted the various problems with the Ericsson function, but he concludes that the skilled person would have spotted those functions given enough time. And it's 286.5. That's the reason why we don't feel that we can urge this evidence on your lordship in this court, because the judge made that finding and that was an evaluation that we can't complain about. But it's 4 and 5. Sorry, I should have said.
How long does the notional skilled person have to reach a result that's obvious? It can take as long as he likes over it, as long as he doesn't do anything inventive.
Well, what a question. My lord, I mean, it's really, the touchstone is obviousness. If an invention is...
Yes, but that doesn't mean instantaneously
No, indeed.
obvious, because if it did, it wouldn't matter.
No, indeed.
Obviousness can involve lengthy, boring, routine work.
Diligent is the judge's word.
Indeed, indeed, and certainly boring. I mean, it's a question of, at that level, it's a question of fact for the individual case, and that's why I can't say that the judge made an error in saying that the skilled person is entitled to more time in this particular case. It depends on context. It depends on context. That's why I can't say this was too long. But I can say, and I do say, that nobody in the world, in any context of hashing, had come up with this idea of using a random number generator as the engine. And certainly those people who were specifically directed at this particular task didn't either. And that the judge records. So, for example, at 292 little Roman 3, the judge says some of the suggestions made, e.g. Qualcomm Samsung, involve the provision of self-contained functions. Of course, by some he means all of the other ones apart from LGE. So the next topic is steps 5 and 6, which I was going to do together. That may be a convenient moment to break.
Yes, certainly. I think you know that we have to rise no less than 4 today. I'm not putting you under any pressure, but just could you tell us how you're doing time-wise?
Yes, I think I'd say it's 50-50 whether I'll finish by 4.
All right.
And if I don't finish by 4, it'll be shortly thereafter in court sitting times.
Okay, very good. We'll resume at 2 o'clock.